Let's continue with this thread then in the next block, because this matters a lot in terms of the sanctions and how it's changing the entire geopolitical world potentially. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen in the way that Putin is viewing the sanctions. He has said in a speech over the weekend that the Western sanctions on Russia are tantamount, quote, to a declaration of war. That's a direct quote.
Yikes.
And threatened Ukraine with loss of statehoods if its leaders continue to resist his military invasion. And actually, while you and I were just speaking, President Zelensky of Ukraine is giving a speech in which he says, you know, Ukraine is continuing to stand. And in addition to asking for a no-fly zone on the economic part, where he has a lot more sympathy here in the West, he is urging a ban of Russian oil and continuing economic sanctions against him. So I think it's very important for people to understand that on the sanctions front, the most maximalists are moving in that direction. I also want to say there's been a lot of talk about companies, you know, pulling out of Russia and all that. I went ahead and asked around, Krystal, and here's what it is. About 80% of these companies, they're pulling out anyway. The reason why is the sanctions. So that the sanctions are underlying the policy. As in, think about it this way. If you have the sanctions that we currently have, and you're doing business in Russia, well, you can't wire any money from there to here. So then you're like, okay, what do I do? Well, what I do is I just use the PR of saying we're pulling out of Russia before I'm forced to say we literally are unable to do business there.
Yeah.
So it's more. It may look like a lot of virtue signaling.
Aren't doing this out of some virtuous desire.
I just want people to know
uphold human rights. I can't believe it.
I just want people to know that most of these companies are not doing this out of the goodness of their heart. I went ahead and asked around people in the Treasury Department, and they were like, "Oh yeah, these people don't care." I'm like, "They're doing it because we're forcing them to do it." So that's clear. It's mostly an action of government policy. That doesn't erase some of the most excesses, which we'll get to later in the show. The most significant one, though, and this is almost, again, from what I hear, a result of sanctions. Let's put this up there on the screen, which is that Visa and MasterCard, which process the vast majority of transactions across, the planet, are pulling out of Russian banks, which is going to force a very interesting thing. Russian banks are now having to switch to the Chinese card system UnionPay, the second largest and fastest growing global credit card network. Now, this is a financial bifurcation that we have really never seen before. China has set up an alternative financial system in their country through Alipay, through Didi, and so many of the companies that they have there, which integrates very cleanly in their social credit system. They don't really have a lot of cash over there. A lot of it is online because that way the government can control all of it. Well, that matters though, because that alternative payment system is totally and completely, quote unquote, sanctions proof from our reach because they built it from the ground up from the 1990s. So now Russian banks are turning to this Chinese-led financial architecture, which is absent from any ability of us in order to sanction it. This geopolitically is a significant development because the fact that the U.S. controls kind of the rails of the global financial system is what makes our sanctions so potent against the rest of the world. You can ask Venezuela and Iran and any other country that has U.S. sanctions about how exactly that goes and how easy it is in order to find somebody to do something as basic as, process your credit card.
Yeah.
These are things that you think are immutable, but in fact can be pulled out by America. Well, as Balaji Srinivasan points out, let's put this up there on the screen, Ukraine may not be becoming a Russian client, but Russia could be becoming a Chinese client economically. Now, this pairs back a little bit with what we were talking about previously, which is that Russia exports the vast majority of its oil to Europe and to China. So if the EU and the United States and the rest of the world does ban Russian oil, China is going to be the last remaining buyer of a lot of Russian oil. Then you have Chinese companies like UnionPay guaranteeing the financial architecture of the entire Russian financial system, China being the second largest economy in the world and the ability to provide them not as good of a customer experience, but somewhat. They could give them Alipay, they could, to replace Apple Pay on their thing. And there's a lot that they could be able to provide them. It could actually push not Russia into the hands of China, but make them pretty economically dependent upon them giving the Chinese a lot of diplomatic leverage over this entire situation. This could be good and it could be bad. It depends on what the Chinese want to do, Krystal. You know, I've been listening, David Kilcullen, he did an episode on the Realignment podcast I was listening to. It was fascinating. And what he was saying is that the Chinese could decide that this is their moment to try and broker some bigger diplomatic solution. So if they have their influence over Russia in the way that they do right now, especially economically, just as the U.S. declared itself independent and tried to score a diplomatic score during the Suez Crisis in the 1950s, China could try and ascend to the world stage and broker some sort of talks between the West and Russia in this situation. That would be really interesting. And actually, it would be a good thing.
Case scenario.
I mean, it would rewrite the entire global order, but you know, it would be a good thing in terms of this immediate conflict in particular. So it just goes to show you that the not even soft power, the financial power of a country matters immensely to its ability in order to, you know, have deals or project diplomacy. And China could, I want to be clear, could flex its muscles here after, in my opinion, miscalculating in its total alliance with Russia ahead of this invasion of the first place.
I mean, that seems to be the reporting, is that they didn't really take the threat seriously. They kind of bought into it's just saber-rattling, or it's just going to go as far as the Eastern Separatist republics. There's a few things to say here. The other part of Balaji's tweet was, he said, we may see China buy Russia for a song in the largest Belt and Road deal of all time after the West dropped the price. And so I think that is the way to think about all of this. It's also worth pointing out, first of all, American Express joined Visa and MasterCard. So you have sort of like unified front now from the American credit card processing companies. What that means in terms of Russian citizens is that they are going to be unable or have difficulty making foreign transactions. The Russian banks have rushed to switch to that Chinese card Union Pay, and it's backed by their own internal system, MIR, I don't know how you pronounce that, MIR. So for domestic transactions, they're trying to smoothly switch over the system so that people can still engage domestically and use their cards and have all of that ultimately work. It's for foreign transactions that this is a problem. And we should also point out, as you are, that, you know, this new financial architecture, both in Russia and more in China, this has been years in the making. Russia started to build up its mere domestic transaction system after sanctions were imposed back in 2014 over Crimea. So again, this is sort of that law of unintended consequences. Us levying these sanctions, it's not that it doesn't have any blowback to us, because the way that we have thrown our economic might around in the world has led both of these countries to say, hey, we can't depend on these people. We need to try to make ourselves sanctions proof. That led to also Russia building up all this foreign reserve currency. We kind of took that off the table by sanctioning their central bank, which again is an extraordinary and, you know, has never happened in history before with regards to a G20 central bank. But you have the Chinese having built up their own architecture as a potential alternative to having to exist in the U.S. system, including their own alternative to the SWIFT banking communication system that is so central to the global financial system. You know, the big fear that people worry about is, what if there is a move away from U.S. dollars as the foreign reserve currency? I think that would be bad. That would be very bad. I think we're probably not quite there. But, you know, the more that we sort of use these types of measures, the more that we create an incentive for countries to protect themselves by having this alternative architecture ready to go. And we are seeing that play out right now in real time in Russia.
Yeah, and we'll end with this, an interesting report from the Wall Street Journal. Let's put this up there on the screen, which is that China had went ahead and declared that its friendship with Russia had, quote, no limits. Given Ukraine, they're starting to have some second thoughts. Basically, it's been a catastrophe, obviously, for Russia. The global public opinion has turned against them. The Chinese see what's happening with the Russian military, and worse, they see that what the potential consequences for them are if they go ahead and invade Taiwan, which is that, you know, the world has responded in such a way and now has a playbook for which they could deploy against China if they wanted to, which would, if you think this is crippling Russia, I mean, China's economy, while yes, they're, you know, internally not as dependent in terms of the West and its exports and all that, we could destroy their economy 10 times over in the way that Russia is as well. So they're looking at this. They're not happy with the way it's played out on the global stage. Actually, it could be a good thing given the leverage now that they have over the Russians. And we're hoping that they might be able to facilitate some sort of peaceful process.
Yeah, I hope they're a good actor in all of this. I mean, that's the best we can.
I doubt it.
That's the best we can hope for. And I mean, part of what they're looking at is Bloomberg Economics estimates that if on top of the sanctions we already have, if we also ban the Russian gas, that would mean their economy would contract about 14% this year.
Wow.
I mean, that's insane. And the Chinese realize, like, on the one hand, we're going to have a lot harder time pulling back from our engagement with the Chinese economy. But the fact that we are so interdependent means it's also extremely vital for them. I mean, they know that the reason that they have grown to be this economic juggernaut is because of their interactions with us and with the West.
Of course.
So
they need oil way more than we do.
Yeah, so that road definitely goes both ways. And also, you know, they're trying to establish themselves as sort of good players in the global system and all of that. And to be seen as siding just directly with Russia on this is, I think, potentially making them uncomfortable. And we've definitely seen the rhetoric shift a little bit for them to express some wariness over this conflict. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.